A wire request lands in your inbox. The name looks right, the tone feels right. Maybe there is even a voice note attached that sounds exactly like your CEO. In the past, that felt like enough to hit send, but in reality, it isn't anymore. The problem we are facing isn't just simple spoofing, it is believable authority. Tools like SPF, DKIM, and DMARC help confirm the path an email took to get to you, but they cannot confirm the actual person behind the decision. That specific gap is where deepfake business email compromise lives. It slips right between authentic delivery and authentic authority. The shift we need is simple, but it's massive. We have to stop trusting signals that people can easily copy and start requiring proof before any action is taken. If you want more Microsoft security strategy like this, make sure to subscribe. Because the first thing that breaks in this new world is the email header itself. The email header is no longer a trust signal. For a long time, we treated the email header like a shortcut for trust. You see the display name, you see the domain, maybe you see an old thread or a writing style that matches what you expect. Your brain fills in the rest of the blanks. You don't actually verify the sender, you just recognize them. Recognition used to be enough because most attacks were rough and easy to spot. They were full of bad grammar, weird timing, and obvious pressure. But that model is gone. AI has raised the floor for every attacker on the planet. They no longer need strong writing skills or an insider tone to get past your defenses. They can generate clean language, mimic the rhythm of a specific executive, and reference current projects to shape a message around real business context. What shows up in your inbox doesn't need to look suspicious. It just needs to feel familiar for a few seconds. This matters because Deepfake BEC isn't just about fake domains. Sometimes the domain is real. Sometimes the account itself is real. The email might come through a trusted SaaS path that already fits your company's normal sending pattern. When that happens, your security stack sees a valid route, while your finance team sees a believable request. Neither of those checks answers the real question. Should this person be allowed to trigger this action? SPF can stop some direct spoofing, and that still has value. But SPF only tells you if a server is allowed to send on behalf of a domain. If an attacker gets into a legitimate mailbox or uses an approved service to send from the right environment, SPF won't help you. The message will still look perfectly clean. DKIM helps with integrity by telling you the message wasn't changed while it was moving. That is useful, but it's narrow. A fraudulent approval request can keep its fraud all the way from the sender to the recipient with perfect integrity. Nothing in DKIM tells you if the decision inside that message is real. DMARC improves the picture when you enforce it at quarantine or reject. The problem is that many domains still sit at monitoring only, which means they collect reports without actually blocking anything. Even a strong DMARC policy doesn't solve compromised accounts or trusted vendors with weak controls. What is actually happening is this. We built our trust around mail characteristics, but the attacker no longer needs to break the mail flow to win. They just need to occupy it. Once the language is polished and the timing fits the business moment, the header stops being a control. It becomes a hint. The hint is too weak for payment approvals or vendor banking changes. Before we talk about stronger controls, we need to be precise. What exactly do these email checks prove, and what were they never designed to prove in the first place? What email security proves and what it never could. We need to draw a very clear line here, because this is the exact point where most security conversations start to get blurry. Mail authentication proves that a server was authorized to send a message, and it proves how that message was handled during transport. But it does not prove that the sender has actual authority, and it definitely doesn't prove that the request inside that email should be trusted by your business. That distinction might sound like a small detail until you actually map it to a real-world approval process. A message can pass every check, from SPF and DKIM to DMARC alignment, and it can still be a blatant request for fraud. This doesn't happen because your security controls failed at their jobs, but because we keep asking those tools to answer a question they were never built to handle. They validate whether the mail systems behaved as they were expected to, but they cannot validate whether the human asking for a payment has the right to make that request. And one level deeper, the rise of deepfakes is making this gap wider every single day. An email can arrive with a perfectly polished message and a cloned writing style, and it might even include a short audio clip or a follow-up call that sounds familiar enough to kill any doubt. Even when the channel checks come back clean, the social proof inside that interaction feels much stronger, and that is exactly where teams get trapped. They confuse authentic formatting with authentic authority. And there are other cracks in the foundation too. Unicode lookalike domains still trick people when they are reading quickly, and approved SaaS or API sending paths can carry malicious messages that fit right into your normal patterns. Support teams might see the right brand, the right signature block, and the right timing, but they still end up approving the wrong action. The problem isn't just about technical evasion, but the fact that business decisions still depend on cues that can be copied perfectly. A lot of companies try to fix this with out-of-band verification. You call the person, you open a chat on Teams, or you try to confirm the request through a different route entirely. That does help, and in many cases, it is still one of the best controls we have available. But it has a hard limit because it depends on people slowing down at the exact moment when the pressure is at its highest. Whether it is an urgent payment, an executive escalation, or an end-of-quarter close, the process always tends to weaken the moment the risk goes up. That is why the zero trust view is so important in this context. You have to stop at verifying the channel and start verifying the actor and the action. You have to ask a different question. Instead of asking if a request came through a trusted path, you should ask if this person can prove they hold the authority this workflow requires right now for this specific decision. That is a completely different model. In the old model, the email carries the trust into the workflow. In the new model, the workflow demands proof before that trust is allowed to move any further. The message can still start the process by notifying or requesting a review, but it no longer has the power to authorize anything on its own. And this is the shift. We are no longer talking about better spam filtering or looking closer at header inspections. We are moving into identity architecture, where the control point sits at the decision itself and where authority has to be proven in a way an attacker cannot fake by writing better text or cloning a voice. That changes the entire design space because once you stop trusting the message, you have to decide what is going to replace it. Entra Verified ID changes the unit of trust. So what replaces the message is not a smarter inbox, but a completely different kind of trust object. Entra Verified ID does not just give your users another login to manage. It allows an organization to issue a verifiable credential, which is a signed piece of proof about a person or an entity that can be presented and checked later. That matters because a login session only tells you that someone got into a system, but a credential tells you what they are actually allowed to claim within a business process. The model is simple on purpose. You have an issuer, a holder, and a verifier. The issuer creates the credential, which could be your own organization or an outside identity partner. The holder keeps that credential in a digital wallet, and the verifier asks for proof whenever a high-risk action needs to be taken. These three roles have clear boundaries, and each one is important because trust is no longer hidden inside the message. It is requested, presented, and checked directly. Under this model, the identifier behind the credential is a decentralized identifier, or a DID. You can think of this as a stable reference point for the entity, while the DID document is where a verifier can find the public keys and metadata needed to check signatures. The credential stays with the holder, the proof is verified cryptographically, and the verifier does not need to call the issuer every single time just to see if the proof is real. That changes the operating model in a very significant way. Instead of relying on a mail trace, a callback habit, or a familiar signature block, the workflow can request a credential and validate it against published keys. If the proof checks out, the verifier can trust the claim because the cryptography matches perfectly. If it does not, the workflow stops immediately, and the trust decision becomes a technical fact rather than an interpretation. The claims inside that credential can go way beyond basic identity. This is where the design becomes incredibly useful for fighting business email compromise. You are not limited to a first name, a last name, or an employee number. You can express a specific role or a specific level of authority. You can identify a treasury approver, an executive payment signer, or an approved vendor banking contact. These are business claims, not just facts from a directory, and that is exactly what high-risk workflows need to see. The question is no longer whether an email looks like it came from the CFO. The question becomes whether the person behind the request can present a valid proof that they currently hold payment authority for this specific action. That is a much tighter check that maps directly to the decision itself. There is another benefit here as well. Verified ID supports something called selective disclosure, which means the verifier does not need the entire credential if the process only requires one specific claim. If a workflow needs proof that someone is an authorized approver above a certain dollar threshold, it does not need to see every other detail about that person. You share less, you prove enough, and you keep the proof narrow. That makes the entire trust model much cleaner. The old model asked people to guess authority based on the context, but the new model asks systems to verify authority using signed claims. One depends on recognition, while the other depends on hard evidence. Once authority becomes a credential instead of an assumption, your whole security design starts to shift. You stop spending all of your energy trying to decide which messages look suspicious enough to block because the message is no longer the place where final trust is granted. The real control moves to the action point, where the money moves, the access changes, or the records get updated. That is the shift in units. You move from the message to the actor, and from the appearance of the sender to their signed authority. You move from communication security to decision security. Once you see that, the next design question becomes very practical. You have to figure out where verified ID actually sits inside a real defense model alongside the controls you already have in place. Where verified ID fits in a real BEC defense model. So where does this actually sit in your security stack without turning into just another identity side project that nobody ever uses? We have to start with the obvious reality. You aren't getting rid of SPF, DKIM, or DMARC anytime soon. You still need phishing-resistant MFA, and you still need your approval thresholds, your separation of duties, and your hard processes around how money moves. None of that goes away because cheap spoofing is still a thing and stolen sessions are still a massive problem. Baseline hygiene is there to cut the noise, and reducing that noise is what keeps your teams from burning hours on low-grade fraud while they accidentally miss the one request that actually hurts. But verified ID belongs at a completely different layer. It doesn't live in the inbox, it lives at the moment of consequence. That is exactly where most security programs still break today. They spend a fortune on detection at the edge of the network, but then they let the risky action itself rely on recognition, speed, or a weak callback habit. The email gets scanned by a filter, the account gets a risk score, the link gets inspected by a sandbox. And then, after all that technology, the actual approval depends on whether a human being believes the request feels normal enough to be real. That is the exact gap that Deepfake BEC is designed to exploit. A better pattern looks like this. The email arrives in the inbox. Maybe it looks perfectly clean, or maybe it raises a few red flags. Either way, that message can trigger a workflow, but the workflow is not allowed to release any value yet. Before the wire transfer is approved, before the bank account details are changed, or before the help desk resets an executive account, the requester has to present a valid credential. They have to prove they have the authority required for that specific action. If there is no proof, there is no release. This design matters because it stops requiring the message to be perfect or the analyst to catch every single detail. The message can start the process, but it is physically unable to finish it. Authority moves out of the inbox and into the control point where the business decision is actually enforced. In your internal scenarios, this usually means using workforce credentials issued by your own organization. You might have an executive approver, a treasury signer, or a service desk escalation sponsor. These work best when the trust boundary is already known and you want full control over the life cycle, including the ability to revoke access the second a role changes. That is one of the strongest reasons to use the model where the organization issues the ID. The same system that knows a person changed jobs can instantly remove the authority behind their credential. External scenarios work a little differently. If a supplier needs to prove they are the approved contact for vendor banking changes, or if a partner needs to verify their identity across company boundaries, portability becomes the priority. That is where partner-issued or ID-verified credentials make more sense because the party relying on the info needs proof that travels across organizations. You can't have every verifier building a private trust arrangement from scratch for every single partner. And none of this becomes real until it connects to the systems that are already releasing value. We are talking about finance approval apps, service desk workflows, and vendor management tools. It might be a custom line of business app or even a simple Power Platform process. The credential request and the verification step have to live inside those parts because that is where trust turns into a payment, an access right, or a change. If you leave verified ID sitting in a demo portal, it stays interesting, but it stays irrelevant to the business. That also means it should connect with Entra and your broader policy layer instead of floating off on its own. Your conditional access, identity governance, role management, and help desk controls should all reinforce each other. One control checks the strength of the sign-in. Another checks the device or the session context. Verified ID then checks the authority for the specific decision being made. That combination is what makes the model strong. It isn't a silver bullet, but it provides tighter proof at the exact point where fraud wants the organization to act. So the architecture is simple to describe, even if the implementation takes some focus. You keep the email defenses, you keep the human process, you add stronger identity proof at the high-risk actions. Then you make the business system enforce it. But there is one more part that decides whether this works or just turns into security theater. The authority inside that credential has to match the authority inside the real-world process. If the business is still issuing broad, vague claims like verified employee, the control might look modern, but it won't actually stop the fraud path you are worried about. Designing credentials around authority, not identity alone, this is the specific point where a lot of teams go wrong. They start by creating a generic credential like verified employee, and they assume that stronger identity automatically solves the fraud problem. It doesn't. A payroll clerk can be a verified employee, a junior analyst can be a verified employee, even a contractor can be a verified employee. None of those facts tell a workflow who is allowed to approve a wire, who can change vendor banking data, or who can authorize an emergency reset for a privileged account. That is where the model has to get much tighter. Identity tells you who the person is, but authority tells you what that person is allowed to do. Those are not the same thing. In most organizations today, those two ideas are mixed together inside email habits, manager expectations, and tribal knowledge. People just know that a certain director usually signs off on certain payments. They know that a specific assistant sometimes relays approvals for the boss. They know that treasury calls a certain person when something looks a bit off. The business works, but a huge amount of the real authority sits in social patterns instead of enforceable controls. That is exactly what attackers are looking to exploit. So your credential design has to separate these claims clearly. One layer identifies the person, another layer states their specific decision right. And then, where it's needed, a third layer sets the conditions around that right, like a dollar threshold, a department, a time limit, or a workflow type. Now the check becomes precise. It isn't just asking if this person is known to the company, it is asking if this person currently holds approval authority for this exact kind of action under these specific conditions. This usually leads to much narrower credential types than people expect to see. You don't want one broad executive credential or one all-purpose finance credential. You want separate ones. You want a payment approval credential for amounts over a defined threshold. You want a vendor master data change authority. You want an emergency identity recovery sponsor. The narrower you make the claim, the easier it is to govern, revoke, and test. Broad authority sounds efficient until it becomes impossible to reason about during a live incident. And revocation matters more here than teams often realize because authority changes much faster than identity does. A person keeps their name, they keep their employee record, but their approval rights can disappear overnight because of a role change, a leave of absence, a reorganization, or a control failure. If the credential model cannot respond to those changes quickly, then the system starts carrying stale trust. That stale trust becomes your new attack surface. This is why simple schema design is so important. Security teams usually want rich claims. Operations teams want low overhead. The business just wants speed. You need all three of those to coexist. If the credential schema turns into a giant complex policy document inside a JSON file, nobody is going to manage it well. Keep the claims limited to what the workflow can actually enforce. You need clear claim names, clear ownership, and a clear revocation path. Boring design is what wins here. There are cases where identity alone is still too weak, even when you have a strong authority claim. Think about sensitive recovery flows, external onboarding, or very high-value approvals. In those moments, you might need stronger proof that the person holding the credential is the real person it was issued to. That is where document verification or a face check can raise the level of assurance. You don't do this for every decision. You only do it where the business impact justifies the extra friction, because friction is the other trap you have to avoid. If every single approval turns into a multi-step ceremony, people will immediately look for shortcuts. They will delegate around the system, they will call support for a workaround, they will ask for exceptions, or they will push the work into side channels. When that happens, the control loses all its force. Strong proof should only show up where the potential loss is high and the frequency is low enough to support the extra steps. Reserve the heaviest checks for the moments that actually need them. So the design rule is simple. Do not issue credentials that merely confirm someone is employed. Issue credentials that map directly to authority in the real business process. Keep those credentials narrow, revoke them fast, and only increase assurance where the risk truly demands it. Now that sounds very clean on paper. The harder part starts when you try to fit all of this into the systems, the habits, and the weird edge cases that are already running the business today. Implementation path: start small, prove control, then scale. How do you actually start this without getting stuck in a massive identity program that stalls for a year? The answer is to start small. Find one workflow where the risk is obvious and the approval path is narrow enough to actually manage. Treasury is usually the cleanest place to begin. Another strong candidate is the help desk identity reset, specifically for executives and admins, because those requests usually come with high pressure and result in immediate access changes. You need to take that specific workflow apart step by step. Look at where the request starts and identify where a person is currently inferring trust from an email, a chat, or a phone call. Then find the exact point where a system finally releases the money or resets the access. Mapping this out is vital because the weak point is rarely where the message first arrives. The real failure happens where the business converts a believable request into a final action. Once you have the map, you can define your issuer model. If the people involved are all internal and the authority stays inside your own tenant, org-issued credentials are your best bet. But if the workflow crosses company boundaries and the other side needs proof they can take with them, you should bring in a trusted ID verification partner. Choosing the wrong model creates massive friction later when revocation and audit requirements start pulling in different directions. The next step is to put the verifier directly into the system that already controls the outcome. Do not build a side portal or a lab demo. Put it in the finance approval app, the service desk workflow, or the vendor change process. If the business system cannot ask for proof and stop the action when that proof is missing, the control stays optional. And we know that optional controls never survive real-world pressure. Keep your pilot group limited and measure 3 specific things. You need to know if the new step blocked risky requests, how much the handling time changed, and how many exceptions popped up. Those numbers will tell you exactly where the design is working and where people are trying to find a way around it. Expect people to push back because wallet setup can be slow and cross-device flows often confuse users. You might find that profile photos are outdated or that support teams don't know how to handle a failed presentation. None of this means the model is broken. It just means identity controls only become real when your operations can support them on a bad day, not just during a polished test. This is also why your fallback paths need strict discipline. If the exception route is too loose, attackers will find it and exploit it first. Keep your break glass options manual and documented, and limit them to specific staff who understand the risk they are taking on. The fallback should be slower on purpose. It needs to feel different because it carries much more exposure. After the first workflow proves it works, you can expand by following the pattern. Reuse that same design for the next approval path that relies too much on simple recognition. Keep your credential types narrow and keep the verifier close to the action. You scale through repeated control logic, not through broad claims or vague governance. At that point, the conversation finally changes. It stops being just an architecture discussion and becomes a leadership decision. It forces a choice about who owns the risk when a high-value action still depends on nothing but an email signal. What leaders need to change now? Business email compromise should no longer sit in the box labeled email security. That framing is far too small, and it keeps your spending pointed at detection while your approval logic stays weak. Leadership needs to ask three very direct questions. First, what business decisions still trust email by default? Second, which specific people can actually prove their authority inside those workflows? And finally, where can money or records still move without cryptographic verification? Answering those questions shifts both your budget and your accountability. Verified ID is not a side experiment for your innovation teams. It belongs in your zero-trust execution, tied directly to identity and risk ownership. You should set one standard that everyone can measure. No high-risk approval happens without proof of authority. That one policy is what finally forces the model to change. Deepfake attacks work because we still trust signals that anyone can fake. The model is broken. If this changed how you think, follow me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn and leave a review. Tell me which topic I should break down next.